A couple things before we get started. There will be no children's church today. The Miss Bell is in Alabama doing a family function, and my wife is on the other side of the state. So no children's church this morning. That's okay because we're gonna do Bible stories this morning. One in particular. The second thing that I asked before we get started is that my wife is driving today from Inverness throughout the day. So just pray that she and my daughter gets home safely, please. All right, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, and we're not really going to read anything. I'm going to tell you a Bible story, and I love telling Bible stories. I mean, when I first got started doing some things within my church, I would do small things here, there, and here, there, and here, there, and then the pastor asked me if I would teach kids. And I tell you what, you never know how little you know about a subject until you try to teach a bunch of kids, okay? Because the one thing that they inevitably say is, why? 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 Why is that? Why? And I found that if you interact with them and get them involved in the actual story, it makes things stick and they understand a little better. But I love telling Bible stories. And one of my favorites is in Daniel chapter 3. I will say that I've told you guys a lot that I have a lot of favorites in the Bible. This is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorites. This is, if I had to pinpoint one story in the Bible that is my favorite and something that has stuck with me, it's Daniel chapter 3. And that is the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was their Babylonian names. It was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah when they were young Jewish men. But to tell the story, and it starts off in Daniel chapter 3, and you could follow along if you want. I think most of us all know this story, right? And we should. If you don't know this story, shame on you. We should all know this story. It's a fantastic story. But Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold in chapter 3, verse 1. And that was the standard thing that a lot of the heathen kings would do. They would make images of themselves and they would put themselves out. We went to a football game yesterday out at the University of Florida. We went to the Gator game, and outside of the Gator game, they have three statues. They have a statue of Tim Tebow, they have a statue of Steve Spurrier, and they have a statue of Danny Warfel. That's what the heathen do. They commemorate things through idols and statues, right? So they made an image of gold. Now, this was a little different than your standard heathen statue. This was big. It was made of gold, and you can see it from a long way away. And he made a decree that if you didn't come and bow down to the statue every time you hear the harp, the harp, the psaltery, the sackbut, and the flute and the dulcimer. My kids always laughed when I would name all the names of the instruments because they would giggle. You ever taught little kids and you say the word sackbut in church, and they all said butt in church. But they would play this music, and if you didn't come down and bow down to the altar, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 6 says, if you don't bow them, you're going to burn. And that's typical paganism. If you don't do what I say, you're going to burn. That's typical tyrant, that's typical heathen, that's typical paganism. That's nothing new. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a bad dude. I mean, he was a real bad dude. As far as bad dudes go, he was one of the worst. There are accounts of Nebuchadnezzar just allowing people to die in his court just for the sake of allowing them to die. He was bored, and one account says he brought in his giant snake and says, you over there, go sit down on the ground. Made him sit down on the ground, and they fed the guy to the snake just for his viewing pleasure. That's the kind of guy that we're dealing with here. So there's no rationality in his thoughts. If he wanted you to die on a whim, you would die on a whim. Your life was nothing to him. So he got mad. He got mad because someone tattled on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Someone tattled, and it was your typical people who do the tattling is the ones that are jealous of you. See, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel, had gained some favor in the community. They'd gained some favor by the king. Back in chapter 1, they committed a vow to God to not defile themselves with the king's table. So when they were pulled from Jerusalem over to Babylon, the king says, I'm giving you all new names. I'm going to feed you directly from my table. They were given a portion of the king's meat, right? And then and all of that was to indoctrinate them into Babylonian society. That was their plan. Well, after 10 days of Daniel refusing to eat, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to eat anything, all they had was bread and pulse and water. It says their countenance was even better than the rest of the people who ate at the king's table. So you can tell right there that both Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah knew that God was blessing them. And that shows up here in this account, this chapter. But they decided that they weren't going to bow. And someone tattled on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in verse 12. Well, Nebuchadnezzar got mad in the very next verse, verse 13. It says, in his rage and fury commanded that they bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in verse 16, I think is one of the greatest verses that you can use to influence your life. This has really kind of impacted me, so I want to share it with you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. We're not bowing. He says we're not gonna take the time. We don't care what you do. I'm never gonna bow before that statue. So he got even madder in verse 19, and he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than it should be heated. So it's at max capacity. He says, keep throwing fuel in there, keep getting it hotter, keep getting it hotter, keep getting hotter, to it's 7 times hotter than normal. And they tried to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there, and we're at about verse 20 now. And he ordered the mighty men, the most mighty men that he had. Now this is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He had mighty men to fight for him. He had men who were renowned for their strength, for their ability at warfare, to kill. He had men who, if he needed someone dead, they would take care of the problem. And he took his best men, the mightiest in the kingdom, and it says, I want you to throw these 3 little Jewish boys in the furnace. And that doesn't make any sense. Why would you command your mightiest men to throw 3 random mid-level rulers in the kingdom into the furnace? But that's what the Bible says. And they threw them in there, and the mighty men died. This is verse 22 or so. And then Nebuchadnezzar meets Jesus in verses 24 and 25. Nebuchadnezzar looks into the fiery furnace and he says, wait a minute, didn't we throw 3 men into the fire? And the people around him says, yes, king, we threw 3 men into the fire. And he says, then why do I see a 4th? And he says, the 4th is like to the Son of God. Now that's a peculiar statement from a pagan king. The question has been asked, how did he know what the Son of God looked like? And that there's no way that Nebuchadnezzar could have ever known that, so that's just something that Daniel wrote in his book to try to Christianize Nebuchadnezzar. I would say that the reason he knew who the Son of God was is because he had Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at his side for 4 years by this time. That's how he knew. But that's beside the point. So they came out of the fiery furnace in verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar realized that 3 men came out of the furnace, not 4, and that they were all completely unharmed. And Nebuchadnezzar makes the decree to not mess with their God. Now, this is often confused with the decree that he decrees later on that we should not worship any other God. That is not what he says here. He says nobody is allowed to say a bad thing about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. Later on, he makes the decree after he comes out of his 7-year stupor where he says, now the God of heaven, the God of Daniel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's who we should be worshiping. So just like us, Just like God dealing with us, you see God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar in stages, little bits at a time. Little bits at a time. He revealed himself to Nebuchadnezzar in steps. And that's often how he reveals himself to us. Because if he reveals himself to us the way he did to Paul, right? Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? What would happen to most of us if he revealed himself to us the way he did to Moses, or the way he revealed himself to Paul? We would run the other way. And Jonah did, right? So we see that God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar in stages. So Nebuchadnezzar in verse 30 promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to be up to higher stature than they already were. So lots of things that we can learn from these three Hebrew children, and very much like Christians today, there are some obstacles in their story that relate to us. So when he says that everybody is to come and worship the king, right? To worship this image. And he says in verse 6, and whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth, the same hour shall be cast in the midst of the burning fire furnace. So what does he say before that, though? Who did he gather together? Look at verse 3. And the princes, and the governors, and the captains, and the judges, and the treasurers, and the counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were all gathered together. You know who we got? Who did Nebuchadnezzar get together? All the important people. So-called important people, right? He gathered all those people together, and he says, everybody's going to do this, or you're going to die. Sometimes, and hear me out for just a second, sometimes it feels like we're going against the grain in this world, does it not? That everybody else is against us. The counselors, the governors, the princes, the principalities, the powers, the spiritual wickedness in high places, all of those things are directly contrary to what we are supposed to be walking every day. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were alone. Now, they had Daniel and they had other the Hebrew children, but they're not mentioned in this story. Daniel particularly is not mentioned in this story. And there's probably a reason Daniel is not mentioned in this story, because just in chapter 1, was it chapter 1 or chapter 2? Chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar bows down to Daniel, and Daniel doesn't do anything about it. So Daniel really can't say anything to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, can he? That's the whole take the beam out of your eye before you worry about the splinter in your neighbor's eye, right? So these three Hebrew children say, we're not careful to answer thee in this matter. We're not going to bow down to you. And it seems like the world system is always against us. There's always someone who has something bad to say. There's always some law being passed. There's always someone who's restrictive there's always someone who's not tolerant of Christians. See, we always hear that saying, you Christians aren't tolerant, you Christians aren't tolerant, you Christians aren't tolerant. If we weren't tolerant, you wouldn't exist. Because the Catholic Church did a really good job of wiping people out that didn't believe what they believed. That's not us. We don't do that. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We're not to go and convert people at the end of the sword or an end of a gun. The Catholic Church has done a fine job of trying that, and they've been very successful at either converting or killing. That's the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do here. The very same thing that Nebuchadnezzar is doing. You either bow or you burn, right? And he got everybody on his side. And sometimes it seems like today we're faced with hurdles and obstacles and roadblocks simply for trying to honor God in our lives. We face an entire multitude of sheep in the world that just follow everything that they're told. The king made an image. He gathered everybody together, and nobody objected. They all complied. They all complied with a pagan king who just came and conquered and destroyed. And we're at odds with a multitude of sheep in this world that are nothing but blind followers of the God of this world. The world says to be scared. The news says to be scared. So what does the multitude do? We panic because the news says we need to be scared. The world says Israel bad. So what do the sheep do? From the river to the sea. That's what the sheep do. Why? Because they can't think for themselves. Because they have no discipline and they have no God. The world says boys can be girls and girls can be boys. And the sheep say trans women are women. Now, I'm not getting into that. That's not what this is about. I'm trying to show you that when the news media or the world systems decides to latch onto something, all they have to do is pipe it through their news systems and people will follow blindly like sheep, just like Nebuchadnezzar did. The things that are going on in this world are not new. They're not new. The devil has not changed his tactics. 6,000 years the devil's been doing the same thing. Yea, hath God said? Are you sure? Are you sure? Because, I don't think that's the way it should be. I think we should tell everybody to be scared of this. So everybody got scared about COVID, and I understand that COVID affected a lot of people, and COVID was a pretty scary thing for a lot of people. But before COVID, there was SARS, and before SARS, there was the bird flu, and before the bird flu, there was this, and before that, there was this. There's always something to scare you, because that's what they do. Some of it is worth some caution. I'm not saying that. Some of it is just something to distract you from things that are going on in this world. You realize that the news media said COVID's bad. True. You guys can't gather together. What happened to the churches? They suffered. You don't think that was intentional? It was absolutely intentional. That was the sheep following Nebuchadnezzar blindly because he said no. My point is the God of this world is spoon-feeding lies, and we are to be contrary to God. Contrary to that God of this world. We're supposed to be contrary to his words. We're supposed to be contrary to the sheep, and we're consistently and constantly being bombarded with satanic propaganda. And we're supposed to be contrary. We're supposed to be something that's against the world. So I told this story in Sunday school. I went to the Florida Gator game last night. And we got to the stadium a couple hours early, so we hung out with my uncle, had some good barbecue, and then we walked around the stadium and took some pictures and did some things with the kids. I had two of my kids with me, but there was a street preacher that was out there, and that street preacher that was out there was a woman, which is fine. I don't have a problem with a woman standing in the corner talking to people, but she had a big loud microphone. And she had a guy that was standing there silently right next to her, just holding a sign. So I see a couple things that are wrong right away. But then I stood there and listened to her for about 20 minutes while I'm taking pictures with my kids and interacting with the people around us. You know what I didn't hear the entire time? The name Jesus. Not once. She was being contrary, but she wasn't being contrary the right way. We're supposed to be contrary to the world. We're supposed to be leading them to Christ because they're already lost. You know what she was saying? I didn't disagree with some of the things that she was saying. I didn't disagree with them. She's saying, you ladies ought to be ashamed of yourself the way you're dressed. That's a true statement because there were some people there that they didn't have much clothes on. Okay? They're college kids at a 7:45 in the afternoon game. They had all day to drink. So some of them were stumbling around. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. True statement. But not one time did she mention Jesus Christ. We're supposed to be contrary to the world, but we're supposed to be contrary for Christ. Not contrary just for the sake of being contrary. Not bullying people into changing their lifestyle because she didn't win anybody that day. As a matter of fact, there was another street preacher around the corner that I actually talked to, and he actually was doing a pretty good job. And they were very, very meek, very humble. They were preached about Jesus Christ, and I spoke to them. They were out of Tampa St. Pete area. Goes up to every game in Gainesville. That's part of their ministry. They drive from Tampa to Gainesville every Saturday, and street preach, right? Well, we were walking away from these guys, or actually walking up to these guys, and Leah can tell you, she heard it. There was a guy behind me who says, "Look at this guy." He says, "I should go up to him and kick him in the balls right now." That's what he said. Actually, I cleaned that version up a lot. Because that's the way the heathen think. They're contrary to anything that has to do with Jesus Christ. Now, that woman that was on the other side of the stadium, she was just contrary just to be contrary. She was just speaking so she can hear herself speak. She didn't win anybody. The other guys who were around the corner, trying to stay away from that nonsense, had the right idea of contrary. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up and says, "I am not careful to answer you in this matter." They were contrary. They didn't have any regard for their lives. They stood there and did what was right in the eyes of God, not which was right in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. And that really leads me to my second point. They said that phrase, "I am not careful to answer thee." It says, "O king, I am not careful to answer thee in this matter." Look at the next verse. I think it's verse 17 you're in now. 16, he says, "I'm not careful to answer thee in this matter. My God, whom I serve, is able to deliver me from the burning fire furnace and from your hands." That's what he says. Right? Contrary the right way. Contrary to something that honors God. Not contrary just for the sake of being rude. Not contrary just for the sake of yelling. Not contrary just for the sake of hearing my own voice. There was a point and a purpose to their contrary. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know what it doesn't say in the passage? You know what it doesn't say in the passage? It doesn't say, "King, we need to go and pray and make sure that it's okay for our God for us to bow down to this image." That's not found anywhere. You want to know why it's not found anywhere? Because they didn't have to pray about that. Because they knew what God would want in their life. Why? You know what that tells me? They had a familiarity with God. They had a familiarity with God, and that's evident by chapter 1, when they were taken from their homeland, and they were taken from their homeland, and they were forced to live off bread and pulse, and God blessed them. They were already familiar with God's words and God's will. They never prayed about it. And they weren't really worried about what Nebuchadnezzar was going to say. Well, you know what? Nebuchadnezzar, you're right. You probably can kill us. It doesn't say, "My God will deliver me." It says, "My God, whom is able to deliver me from the burning fire furnace and from your hand." It says, "My God is capable of doing so. And if he wills it," see, they were open to the possibility that God was not going to answer their prayer. They were open to that possibility that God was going to allow them to die. And we should have that same mentality. We should be open to the possibility that God will let us go through some hardships to get through to a guy like Nebuchadnezzar. That's our God. That's how he works. We may not understand it. We may not like it. But sometimes we have to go through the ringer in order to help somebody else. That's no more evident than anybody who's ever been called into a ministry. See, I'll give you a personal example. My wife will tell you that she knew I was going to be a pastor long before I ever knew that I was going to be a pastor. And that was never on my radar, ever. Me being a pastor. That wasn't on my radar. It's not something that I felt called to do. It's not something that I ever had I guess you would call a desire to do. I just wanted to learn the Bible and to serve. That's what I thought I thought I was, the will of God for me was just to sit in a pew and serve. And I tell you what, churches need that. So don't think that I'm downgrading people who do that. Churches need that, otherwise they will fail. I don't care how charismatic and personality the preacher is. They need people who are willing to sit and pray and serve and work, right? And I thought that was my will, and I was okay with that. But my wife saw a calling for me before I ever saw it. And by the time I saw it, it was too late. God had already started putting me through some things. For two reasons. He put me through some things for two reasons. One, to get my attention. And two, so that once he finally got my attention, I would have the capability of ministering to others who had gone through the same hardships that I had gone through. So, loss happened in my life. Hardships, trials happened. And since I surrendered so late, after he had been calling for so long, he had to throw all of those hardships in a very short time period to get my attention and to get me to understand that, hey, I'm going to help you through this, but you need to go through some things. Well, I didn't understand why I was being put through some things until someone from the church came to me crying and say, this and this and this is happening in my life, and I don't know how to fix it. Light bulb went off. So just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they understood this. You know what? Because they had a relationship with God. They understood. My God, whom I serve, is able to deliver me from the burning fire first, and from your hand, O King. Who is able? Who is able? Now, that's interesting to me because he certainly is able. But if you notice in verse 18 that they were willing to die for their faith. They had a God who was able to deliver them, but they were willing to die for their faith. Now, we in this country don't have that problem. Not yet. Not yet. They were willing to die for their faith. They knew God could save them, but they also knew God can allow them to perish, and they were willing either way. So, with the willingness comes a lot of different things. With the willingness comes a lot of different things that it might be something hard for some of us to swallow, but sometimes God will also do some things to you just to make sure that you're willing to serve. So God did some things, or allowed some things to happen in my life for two reasons. One, to get my attention. Two, to make sure that I accepted my call and that I can be able to minister to others. But sometimes things are put in front of us just to see how willing we are to follow and to serve. And there's some examples of this. Abraham took Joseph up on a mountain, didn't he? He did that out of obedience. Abraham took his son up on a mountain. Isaac. He took Isaac. I said Joseph, didn't I? That's what happens when you get in at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, sorry. Abraham took Isaac up on a mountain, right? Out of obedience. God wanted to see if he was willing. And we don't like that. We don't like the thought of God doing something like that to us. That seems too rash, too harsh for us, doesn't it? Well, there are some things about Abraham that that we don't understand that Abraham understood. Abraham was banking on the resurrection. It says in Hebrews that he did that with the understanding that God was going to raise him up. He was willing to die for his faith. You realize Isaac willingly went up that mountain? You think Isaac couldn't have overpowered his daddy when he says, "You're the lamb, son"? I think halfway through that trip up the mountain, Isaac probably figured something out. He was not a dummy. And Abraham, he knew something was off with Abraham because it took a lot longer to get to the base of the mountain than it should have. And he was crying the whole way up, and he was praying, and something was definitely wrong with Abraham. And Isaac figured it out. The Lord will provide us a ram. The Lord will provide us. The Lord will provide us. Dad, we got the wood. Dad, you left everybody else down on the mountain. You never did that before. You always let them come up with us. What's the matter? You got the wood. We got the knife. We're missing something, Daddy. He wasn't a 10-year-old little boy at the time. He was a man. He could have overpowered his dad. You know what he did? He said, all right, Dad, that's what God says. Talk about willing. He laid down his life on the altar of obedience to his father, who was being obedient to God. Man. Tell you what, you ever want to be used for God, you have to have a willing attitude. You have to be willing. You got to be willing to serve. Now, I'm not telling you that God's called you to go kill your kid, so don't go say that. Okay? What'd you learn at church today? Well, honey, my preacher said if it's okay to go kill our kids, as long as we're willing to do it in the name of the Lord. That's not what I'm saying. Okay? Seems like these internet kooks will find something to say, right? So I guess I have to put a disclaimer out there, right? Yeah, what I'm trying to say is you have to be willing to do what is necessary to serve. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were willing to die. Willing to die. Why? So they didn't dishonor God. That's it. You know how easy it is to dishonor God today? You know how many times it happens a day that we dishonor God? And these men were willing to die for it. Are you willing? Are you willing to serve? Has God been tugging on your heartstrings? Has He been dealing with you about a change in your life? No, I'm asking that, but I already know the answer. I know He's dealing with some of you. I know He is. Because I know how He deals with people. Because He's dealt with me. I know God deals with people differently. I know God tugs on your heart. I know God calls you to do certain things. And I know God speaks to you in different ways than He might speak to me. But I know God's working in your life. I know He is. Because that's my God. I know He's pulling on someone's heartstrings to do something, to serve, to read the Bible more, to pray more, to whatever. It doesn't matter what it is. I know God's dealing with you about something. And you have to be willing in order to do something about it. You have to be willing to do something about it in order to serve. Now, we spoke at length about how the world is often against us. And often that causes those trials and tribulations. And if you read verses 17 to 25, Nebuchadnezzar absolutely freaked out when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, I ain't doing it. I mean, he flipped his lid. The most powerful man in the world having a temper tantrum like a 3-year-old. I mean, kicking and screaming. And who do you think you are? Blah, 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 blah. Heat the furnace, keep throwing wood in the fire, keep throwing wood in the fire. You're going to die, you're going to burn. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, well, if that's what you want, King. Do you know, we often think that God worked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God manifested Himself when they looked in the fiery furnace and they weren't dead. But God was with them long before that. He was with them long before that. He was with them in chapter 1 when they got taken from their homeland. He was with them. Do you guys remember I said He brought the mighty men of the kingdom to throw them in the furnace? That didn't make any sense. You know why it made sense? You know why it makes sense? Because the mighty men died throwing them into the furnace. Now to me, just based on pure logic, that if the mighty men that Nebuchadnezzar had them throwing them into the furnace died, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should have been dead too. If the mighty men died before they got thrown into the furnace, how did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get in the furnace? How? Boy, when that guy, that big old brute carrying Shadrach, went to go take those steps in and They didn't die from the heat. They died probably from inhaling the superheated air that was around them, and they choked and died. Now, the moment that the guy carrying Shadrach to throw him in, kick the bucket, the guy says, "You're dead like that." I mean, you're done, right? Shadrach turns around and goes, "Yep." I mean, it clicks. You ever had that moment when you'd realized, wait a minute, I see what you did there, God? You ever had that moment? I've had that moment where sometimes years later, that thing pops into your head and it clicks and you went, I should have known. The whole time it was you. The whole time. Well, Shadrach Meshach and Abednego had that. I mean, these guys are trying to throw them in the furnace and they're croaking and we're fine. It's not even breaking a sweat. It's getting hot in here. No, it's not. They're like not even breaking a sweat. That's when they knew God was there. So they said, let's look into that furnace. And you know who they saw in the middle of that furnace? They saw a fourth man that was before they were ever in there. Now, I know I'm extrapolating a little bit on the story. I know I'm kind of taking some liberties. I understand that. But to me, that's what happened. Because they looked into that furnace because them three men that are trying to carry them into the furnace are dead behind them. Remember, they're bound. They're bound in their clothes, and it says in their breeches. So they got their coats and their pants on, right? And they're bound, getting ready to be thrown into the furnace, and the people around them are dying because it's so hot. And they're protected. And I can just imagine, again, this is a liberty, it doesn't say this in the scripture, but I can just imagine them looking in that furnace and seeing Jesus Christ in the middle of that furnace and say, that's our guy, let's go. Jump right in. And they have a little party in the middle of the fire. They had some sweet fellowship with God in the middle of the worst tribulation and trial that they've ever had in their entire life is when Jesus Christ was there, and they had some sweet fellowship, and they loved him. You know what? They had to wait for the furnace to cool down to get the men out. That didn't take 5 minutes. Anybody here ever had a pallet fire? Man, good time, right? But when you throw about 10 pallets on that fire and flame goes up and you have to back up and back up and back up, that flame doesn't go out in 2 minutes. You got to wait a little while before you can get close enough to get in proximity to that fire. Them flames had to die out a little bit before they can get them men out of that furnace. And when they came out, there was only 3 of them. But Nebuchadnezzar says, I know I saw 4. Where's the 4th? I said, don't worry about that. You'll meet him later. Your fiery furnace hasn't come yet, Nebuchadnezzar. Your fiery furnace is going to be a 7-year-long tribulation. That's where you'll meet Jesus. But let me tell you something. In the middle of all of our trials and tribulations, in the middle of that fiery furnace, they knew God was with them before they ever went into it. When they came out unbound. You know what that means? That means the fire and the flames licked the ropes off of their hands and their feet. But it never touched them. It says they didn't even smell of smoke. Anybody, like I said, we come from Indiana. We love sitting around the fire ring in the spring and the fall, the summer. We love sitting around that fire ring, cooking, camping, all that stuff. We love doing that stuff. And the problem is, when I did that on a Saturday, I'd smell like smoke on Sunday. I have to take a shower in the morning, right? Because it's just, I smelled like, it's not like the bad smoke. It's not like cigarette smoke. You can tell the difference between campfire smoke and cigarette smoke. I never took that chance. I never went to church smelling like smoke. But the point is, man, you stunk. Can you imagine being thrown in the middle of a furnace? Can you imagine the stuff that would stink? The stink that would come on you? The flames never touched their hands, even though it burned the ropes on their wrist. The stink of the smoke never even got on them. You know what happens sometimes when you go contrary to this world? You go through the fire and you go through the flames, but the stink of the world doesn't stick on you sometimes. And I just absolutely love this story about how these men were called by God to do something. And they were contrary to the world, and being contrary to the world should be normal in your life. We should normalize that, being contrary to the world instead of trying to fit in. We should normalize being contrary to the world. We should know God's will well enough that we don't have to be prayerful on some things. There are some things that we don't have to pray for. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego never prayed here. You know what God told Joshua? God told Joshua he sent some men up to Ai to go take out this little bitty village over there. That's just nothing. We just had this great battle in Jericho. The walls came tumbling down. We didn't have to shoot an arrow, and all the walls of Jericho came down. I mean, God's with us. Go up to Ai, just take it out. Take a couple men, go. Right? They got whooped. They didn't pray about it. Well, they came back and they lost some men. So Joshua started praying. You know what God told them? Get up, stop praying. There's some things we don't have to pray about. He said, get up, stop praying. You need to fix something and then pray about it. You got some sin in your camp. You got a man over there in your camp who was contrary to what I said. You got some sin going on. I can't bless it if there's sin going on. You need to stop praying about where I went wrong. You need to fix some things and then come to me and pray. There's some things we don't have to pray about. You know, you never have to pray whether it's God's will to hand somebody a gospel tract. You never have to pray that. Lord, should I give them a gospel tract? The answer is always yes. There's some things that are always in God's will. There's some things that are always in God's will. You don't have to pray about it. Do right. You don't have to pray about doing right. Just do right. You don't have to pray about it. Now, God wants you to pray about it. He wants you to make sure you're doing right. And He wants you to pray about it. Lord, help me to do right. He wants that. But doing right is not something you should be prayerful over. Should I do it or should I not do it? Yes, do it. Do right. That's always in God's will. It's always in God's will for you to be saved. If you don't know Jesus Christ, you're out of God's will. And if you don't know Him as your personal Savior, as someone who you put your faith and trust in, you're out of God's will. It's God's will right now for you to get into the will of God and to accept Jesus. That is always in the will of God, getting saved, getting right with Him, doing right. There's some things we don't have to pray about, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't have to pray about doing the right thing. I don't need to pray, Lord, Nebuchadnezzar, to say that I'm not going to bow down to that image. So remember, to be contrary to this world, we should know enough about God to know His will, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And God's always with us in the midst of trials and tribulations. God's always with us in the midst of those trials and tribulations. To be honest with you, that's when I've had some of the best fellowship with the Lord that I've ever had, is when I was in the middle of trials. You know whose fault that is? This is a little side note. That's your fault. That was my fault, that I had the best fellowship I've ever had in the middle of a trial and tribulation, because I didn't have that relationship with Him prior to that. I didn't seek Him out prior to that. We are reactive instead of proactive as Christians. We need to be proactive as Christians and not reactive. Don't wait for something bad in your life to pray. If you know a machine's going to break down and if you don't change the oil, is it better to be proactive or reactive? Proactive, right? Nope, let's just wait for the engine to blow and then we'll replace the motor and the oil with the motor. Doesn't make any sense. Be proactive. You don't have to wait for something to go wrong to get a hold of God. He's always there. And last, and certainly not least, you must be willing in order to serve, just like they were. They were willing to die. They were willing to do what it was necessary to honor God. You need to be willing to serve. I'm not telling you to go throw yourself on the altar of this world and let Him crucify you. That's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm just telling you that when God calls, be willing. When God calls, be willing. So with every head bowed, every eyes closed, I just want you to take a moment and pray with me. Take a moment, just be silent and pray, because I know Lord's working on somebody right now. Are you willing? Well, what do you mean? Am I willing what? To do what? Doesn't matter. For some of you young men, it might be the call to serve. For some of you young men, it might be the call to speak up about God. For some of you young people, there's a multitude of things that the Lord wants you to do, and you just have to be willing. You have to be willing to hear His voice. And I know the Lord's working on somebody here. So I pray that you allow Him to have room. Give place to Him so He can work in your life. But you have to be willing. Lord, I pray that you be with these people. Lord, I pray that you lift them up. Lord, I pray that you help these words to fall on good ground in their hearts so that it might make a difference in their lives. Lord, I pray that you help these people to hear your voice. And when they hear your voice, to recognize your voice. And when they recognize it, to honor it. Lord, to heed what you have to say. I thank you for everything you've done for us. Thank you for this blessed book you've given us, Lord, so that we can take these stories that happened thousands of years ago and really make something out of it today for us. That only happens in your book. Just evidence once more that this book that you've given us is your words. Not your word, but your words. Thank you for everything you've done for us. I pray that you bless us and guide us and lead us back to the doors that are open at the appointed time, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. See you at 6.